In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, 1944, something extraordinary happened in the dense forests of the Ardennes that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of modern warfare. The German Wehrmacht had assembled one of the most powerful offensive forces seen since the early years of the conflict, a desperate final throw of the dice ordered by Adolf Hitler himself in what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German soldiers had been concentrated in absolute secrecy along an 85-mile front, supported by approximately 1,000 tanks, including the formidable Tiger and Panther variants, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces carefully concealed beneath the fog-shrouded canopy of the Ardennes forest. The strategic concept was audacious in its scope and born from the desperation of a crumbling regime. Hitler envisioned a massive armoured thrust through the lightly defended Ardennes sector that would drive northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp, effectively splitting the Allied armies in two and potentially forcing the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein or Watch on the Rhine, represented the Third Reich's last realistic chance to alter the seemingly inevitable outcome of the European war. German intelligence had correctly identified that this sector was held by a mixture of inexperienced units, fresh replacements barely out of training, and exhausted divisions recovering from earlier battles. The Americans, flush with recent victories following the liberation of France, had grown perhaps complacent about the Wehrmacht's remaining offensive capabilities. When the German artillery barrage commenced at precisely 5:30 that frozen morning, it was overwhelming in its intensity and scope. 1,600 rounds per minute hammered American positions across the entire front, severing communications, destroying command posts, and creating chaos throughout the defending units. The surprise was absolute and catastrophic. Entire American regiments found themselves cut off and surrounded before they fully understood what was happening. In many sectors, the German advance proceeded exactly as planned, with panzer columns exploiting gaps torn open by the initial assault and driving deep into American-held territory. Yet even in those first chaotic hours, elements of the American defense demonstrated a stubbornness that would prove critical. At key crossroads and bridge sites, small groups of defenders held their ground with a tenacity that disrupted German timetables and created bottlenecks in the offensive. Among these desperate defensive stands was the position held by the 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit that suddenly found itself directly in the path of the German juggernaut. The squadron's survival depended on artillery support, but conventional artillery fire was proving inadequate against the massed German formations advancing through the forest. This was when Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson, commanding officer of the 406th Artillery Group, faced a decision that would echo through military history. Watching his cavalry squadron on the verge of being overwhelmed, Axelson understood that standard high-explosive shells detonating on impact would be insufficient to stop the German assault. The problem with conventional artillery had always been its predictability. Soldiers could take cover in foxholes, behind trees, in trenches, and significantly reduce their exposure to shell fragments. Experienced troops knew how to read the patterns of artillery fire and find relative safety even under heavy bombardment. What Axelson possessed, locked away under the strictest security classification, was ammunition that rendered those defensive calculations obsolete. Without seeking higher authorization, acting on his own judgment in the heat of battle, he ordered his gunners to load shells equipped with what the Americans called the proximity fuse. This device, shrouded in secrecy rivaling that of the Manhattan Project, represented one of the war's most closely guarded technological breakthroughs. Standing orders explicitly prohibited its use in ground combat, specifically because of fears that an unexploded round might fall into enemy hands and reveal its secrets. But Axelson, facing the imminent destruction of American forces under his protection, made the calculation that saving lives in the present moment outweighed the theoretical future risk of compromise. The shells that left American gun tubes that morning looked ordinary from the outside, standard high-explosive projectiles indistinguishable from millions of others. but concealed within the nose of each round, protected by a shell casing no larger than a coffee can, was a technological marvel that German scientists had declared impossible to achieve. Inside that compact space, engineers had managed to fit a miniature radar transmitter, a complete radio system capable of surviving the almost unimaginable violence of being fired from a cannon and then functioning flawlessly during its flight to target. The physics involved were staggering. When an artillery piece fires, the shell experiences acceleration forces reaching 20,000 times the force of gravity, a level of stress that would instantly destroy virtually any electronic device. The interior of the gun barrel reaches temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for the brief instant the shell passes through. Then the projectile emerges into the frigid air of a Belgian winter, subjected to thermal shock that would crack or shatter most materials. Throughout its flight, the shell spins at tremendous velocity to maintain stability, generating centrifugal forces that would tear apart ordinary components. To overcome these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, American researchers and engineers had been forced to completely reinvent electronic miniaturization. The effort was centered at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under the direction of Dr. Merle Tuve, working in facilities deliberately disguised as a used car dealership to maintain security. The team had to shrink vacuum tubes, the standard electronic components of the era typically found in household radios, down to the size of pencil erasers. These miniature tubes had to be manufactured with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch and then carefully cushioned within the fuse housing to survive the firing shock. The operational principle, while conceptually simple, required extraordinary precision in execution. The fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter that sent out continuous electromagnetic pulses as the shell flew toward its target. These pulses reflected off the ground, off trees, off buildings, and critically, off human bodies. A receiver in the fuse constantly monitored the strength of the returning echoes. As the shell descended and approached the ground, the reflected signal grew stronger. The fuse electronics were calibrated to trigger detonation when the signal strength indicated the optimal height, typically between 20 and 50 feet above the ground, depending on the target. At this precise altitude, the exploding shell created a lethal cone of steel fragments spreading downward and outward across a wide area. Every piece of shrapnel followed ballistic trajectories calculated to maximize casualties among troops on the ground. Foxholes offered no protection because the fragments came from above. Trees provided no shelter because the bursts occurred above the canopy. Even buildings with intact roofs became death traps as shrapnel punched through the relatively thin materials. The lethality increase compared to conventional shells was dramatic, with studies eventually showing improvement factors of 5 to 10 times depending on terrain and target conditions. The development history of this weapon stretched back to the war's opening years. Ironically, German researchers had been the first to explore the concept seriously. As early as 1940, engineers at Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had constructed working prototypes of proximity fuses using photoelectric cells and crude radio systems. Their early tests showed promise, demonstrating that the fundamental principles were sound. However, Adolf Hitler, obsessed with achieving quick victories and impatient with any technology that could not be deployed within 6 months, personally ordered the cancellation of the proximity fuse program. German scientists, already skeptical about the practicality of building electronics robust enough to survive gunfiring, accepted this decision without significant protest. They concluded that the technical challenges were simply too great to overcome with available resources and turned their attention to more conventional weapons development. The Americans and British, approaching the problem from a different direction and with greater industrial resources, refused to accept these limitations. By 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day, an astonishing feat of mass production that required the coordination of more than 100 separate companies. Major corporations, including RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, and Crossley Corporation, had converted entire production lines from consumer goods to fuse manufacturing. Refrigerator factories now built weapons. Radio assembly lines now produced instruments of death. The workforce consisted largely of women, many of them young and working 12-hour shifts, who assembled and tested each of the approximately 130 individual components that went into every fuse. The quality control standards were unforgiving. Every solder joint had to be inspected under magnification. Every vacuum tube had to be individually tested. Every completed fuse received a serial number and underwent firing tests before being approved for combat use. A single defective component could cause the entire shell to fail, potentially leaving American troops without the protective fire they desperately needed, so no error was acceptable. The financial investment in this program was staggering even by wartime standards. The total cost exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, making it the second most expensive weapons development program of the entire war, surpassed only by the Manhattan Project's atomic bomb. The American government had essentially bet that this single technological innovation could provide sufficient military advantage to justify an expenditure equivalent to a significant fraction of the total defense budget. When Colonel Axelson's gunners loaded those first proximity-fused shells and pulled the lanyards, they unleashed something the German soldiers advancing through the Ardennes had never experienced and could not comprehend. The men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, moving forward in the pre-dawn gloom toward the small town of Monschau, were veterans of the Eastern Front. They had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, battles of unimaginable ferocity where artillery fire had been a constant presence. They knew the sound of incoming shells, knew how to judge the trajectory, knew when to dive for cover and when to keep moving. Their experience had taught them the rhythms of artillery combat and given them confidence in their ability to survive under fire. The first proximity-fused shells shattered those assumptions completely. Instead of the expected impacts against the ground, followed by the familiar pattern of shrapnel radiating outward at relatively predictable angles, the shells detonated high above the forest canopy in brilliant flashes of light and sound. Steel fragments rained straight down through the trees, cutting through branches and turning the wood itself into additional projectiles. Soldiers who had taken cover behind fallen logs or in hastily dug foxholes discovered that their shelter was meaningless. The danger came from directly overhead, from a direction no trench or earthwork could protect against. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Combat veterans, men who had faced Soviet artillery for years and developed techniques for survival, suddenly found all their hard-earned knowledge useless. The air itself had become weaponized. Young soldiers, conscripts thrown into battle with minimal training, broke completely under the strain. Even experienced non-commissioned officers and officers struggled to maintain unit cohesion as casualties mounted with terrifying speed. The forest echoed with screams and confusion as German formations disintegrated under fire they could neither understand nor counter. At the American gun lines, Axelson's decision was proving its worth in the starkest possible terms. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, which had been on the verge of being overrun, found breathing room as the German assault stalled and then collapsed. Survivors of the German units, those who managed to fall back through the killing zone, carried with them stories of a new weapon that seemed to possess impossible capabilities. Shells that burst at precisely the right height, that found soldiers no matter where they hid, that turned familiar terrain into a death trap. These reports raced up the German chain of command, creating confusion and alarm at every level. Field commanders demanded explanations. Was this some new type of chemical weapon? Had the Americans deployed poison gas in violation of international law? Were there observers somehow directing each individual shell? No conventional explanation seemed to fit the observed facts, and without understanding the nature of the threat, German officers struggled to develop effective countermeasures. Some units attempted to disperse more widely, thinking that spreading out would reduce casualties, only to discover that the wide fragmentation patterns of the airbursts covered even dispersed formations effectively. Others tried massing together for mutual support, which simply created denser target concentrations that proximity-fused shells could devastate with horrifying efficiency. The battle developed rapidly across multiple sectors of the Ardennes front. At Bastogne, a critical road junction that became the focal point of the entire campaign, American airborne troops of the 101st Airborne Division found themselves surrounded by German forces but sustained by artillery fire that included increasing numbers of proximity-fused shells. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, though cut off from easy resupply, maintained a steady rate of fire that broke up German assault after German assault. Over the course of 2 weeks, this single battalion would fire approximately 7,000 rounds, a significant portion of them equipped with the secret fuse. When German commanders delivered an ultimatum demanding the surrender of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single word that would become legendary: nuts. His confidence was not misplaced. The artillery ring around Bastogne, increasingly armed with proximity fuses as supplies were rushed forward, created a protective barrier that German infantry could not penetrate. Each time the Wehrmacht launched an attack across the snow-covered fields surrounding the town, American artillery observers called down fire that burst overhead, scything through the advancing formations with mechanical precision. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit that history has often overlooked, played a crucial role in Bastogne's defense. Their guns maintained a steady cadence of fire throughout the siege, their shells exploding above German assembly areas and cutting down troops before they could even begin their assaults. The proximity fuse did not discriminate based on who fired it. In the hands of these skilled but often marginalized soldiers, it proved just as deadly as in any white unit, and their contribution to holding Bastogne was enormous. Further north along the defensive line, at a geographic feature called Elsenborn Ridge, American forces faced what was arguably the most dangerous German formation in the entire offensive. The 6th SS Panzer Army, spearheaded by the elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, represented the cream of the Waffen-SS, fanatical soldiers with years of combat experience and a reputation for both military effectiveness and brutal tactics. They attacked the ridge with determination bordering on recklessness, throwing regiment after regiment against American positions in an attempt to achieve the breakthrough that would open the road to Antwerp. The American defense of Elsenborn Ridge was primarily conducted by the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, and it became a demonstration of what massed artillery armed with proximity fuses could achieve. Over 3 days of intensive combat, American guns fired approximately 160,000 shells at German positions and attacking formations. Only about 40,000 of these rounds, roughly 1/4 of the total, were proximity fused. Yet post-battle analysis would show that those 40,000 shells accounted for more than 60% of all German casualties inflicted by artillery at Elsenborn Ridge. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Each proximity-fused shell was worth approximately 10 conventional shells in terms of casualties inflicted. Entire SS companies ceased to exist as coherent units after being caught in the open by proximity fuse barrages. Survivors described climbing over piles of their own dead, advancing a few more meters, and then being cut down by another wave of air bursts. The steep forested slopes that should have provided the attackers with cover instead became killing grounds as shells burst above the trees and rained steel fragments down through the canopy. Elite SS troops, men who had been indoctrinated to believe in their own superiority and invincibility, broke under the strain. Officers reported units refusing to advance, soldiers seeking any excuse to avoid being sent forward into the invisible death that waited in the air above no man's land. The psychological damage was in some ways as significant as the physical casualties. The SS had always prided itself on fanatical determination and willingness to accept losses in pursuit of objectives, but there were limits even to that conditioning, and the proximity fuse had found those limits. By December 21st, 5 days into the offensive, senior American commanders recognized that the proximity fuse was proving decisive. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, made the critical decision to lift all restrictions on its use. The weapon was no longer secret, at least not in practical terms. German troops all along the front had experienced its effects, and while they might not understand the technical details, they knew the Americans possessed artillery that could burst at the optimal height every single time. The risk of compromise, which had worried planners before the battle, was now irrelevant compared to the immediate need to stop the German offensive. Orders went out across the European theatre of operations. Every artillery unit was to be supplied with proximity fuses as quickly as logistics could manage. Trains and trucks rushed ammunition forward from depots in France. Self-propelled howitzers, particularly the M7 Priest with its 105mm gun, became highly effective platforms for delivering the new munition. These mobile artillery pieces could keep pace with armoured columns, providing fire support wherever it was needed most urgently, and their crews learned to appreciate the devastating effect of shells that required no complex adjustments or calculations to achieve maximum effectiveness. The African-American gunners of the 969th Artillery Battalion, previously mentioned, earned particular distinction during this period. Often assigned to separate units and given less recognition than their white counterparts despite equal or superior performance, these soldiers proved that courage and skill had no colour. Their guns helped create the ring of fire that made Bastogne impregnable, their shells falling with such precision and reliability that German commanders eventually concluded that certain sectors were simply impossible to penetrate. On Christmas night, December 25, 1944, the proximity fuse provided one of the most documented demonstrations of its capabilities. German forces attempting to cross the Sauer River under cover of darkness believed they had achieved surprise. The night was cold and cloudy, visibility was poor, and they had reason to think that American artillery would have difficulty engaging them effectively under such conditions. They were catastrophically wrong. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne, was present near the river that night and witnessed the engagement firsthand. American artillery observers, using sound detection equipment and pre-registered fire coordinates, called down concentrations of proximity-fused shells on the German troops caught in the open along the riverbanks and in the water itself. The shells burst overhead with mechanical regularity, each one showering fragments downward across a wide area. German soldiers had no cover, no protection, nowhere to hide. Those who tried to retreat back across the river were cut down. Those who tried to press forward into the American positions were killed before they could reach the far bank. When daylight came and the bodies could be counted, American troops tallied 702 dead German soldiers in a relatively small area, the remains of what had been an entire battalion. Patton would later write about this engagement in his memoirs, describing it as one of the most efficient and complete destructions of an enemy force he had witnessed during the entire war. The proximity fuse had transformed what might have been a serious threat requiring hours of close combat into a one-sided massacre that ended in minutes. The Sauer River crossing entered military history as a case study in the lethality of properly employed artillery. Back at Bastogne, the siege continued, but the outcome was increasingly certain. When German officers delivered their surrender ultimatum, McAuliffe's defiant reply of nuts was backed by the knowledge that his artillery could defend the perimeter indefinitely as long as ammunition held out. And ammunition was arriving, including ever-increasing quantities of proximity fuses. Each German assault was met with carefully coordinated artillery fire that burst overhead, turning open fields into killing zones that could not be crossed. The 101st Airborne, supported by artillery including the 406th and 463rd Battalions, held firm while Patton's Third Army drove north to break the encirclement. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th was a major turning point in the battle, but the fighting continued throughout the region. German forces, though increasingly desperate, launched continued attacks in various sectors, still hoping to achieve some kind of breakthrough that might salvage the offensive. Each time they concentrated forces for an assault, American artillery responded with proximity fuses. Each time they tried to advance across open ground, shells burst overhead. The Wehrmacht was learning a harsh lesson about technological inequality, discovering that courage and determination could not overcome a fundamental disadvantage in weapons capability. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At dawn, approximately 900 German fighters rose into the air in what was intended to be a devastating blow against Allied air power. The attack achieved considerable surprise and destroyed numerous Allied aircraft on the ground before they could take off. It seemed briefly like the kind of dramatic success that might alter the course of the battle. However, as the German pilots turned for home, they flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything they had experienced. American and British anti-aircraft batteries, now equipped with proximity-fused shells, no longer needed to visually track individual aircraft and try to estimate the correct altitude for their time-fused shells to detonate. The proximity fuse solved that problem automatically, with each shell effectively seeking its target and detonating at the optimal distance. The sky filled with precisely timed explosions as German fighters flew through a barrier of steel fragments. The losses were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Of the approximately 277 German aircraft lost on January 1st, 172 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. This represented the greatest single-day loss of German aircraft to anti-aircraft artillery in the entire war, a testament to the proximity fuse's effectiveness against aerial targets. The Luftwaffe, already severely weakened by years of attrition, never recovered from this blow. Operation Bodenplatte, intended to regain air superiority, instead marked the effective end of German air power as a significant factor in the war. Throughout January, as the German offensive ground to a halt and then reversed, the proximity fuse continued to demonstrate its value. American forces, now on the offensive themselves, used the weapon to support their own advances. German troops attempting to establish defensive positions found that their trenches and foxholes provided little protection against shells that burst overhead. Rear area formations, previously relatively safe from artillery fire if they kept adequate distance from the front lines, discovered that proximity fuses extended the lethal reach of American guns significantly. The psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet artillery barrages that dwarfed anything in Western Europe in terms of sheer volume of fire, reported that the American proximity fuse was more terrifying than anything they had experienced before. The randomness of death under conventional artillery fire, while certainly frightening, at least gave soldiers the feeling that their survival was partially under their own control. They could dig deeper trenches, find better cover, time their movements between shell impacts. The proximity fuse stripped away that illusion of control entirely. Young German soldiers, boys really, many of them conscripts who had been pulled from schools and given minimal training before being thrown into combat, simply could not cope with the new reality. Units reported widespread cases of combat fatigue, psychological breakdowns, and outright refusal to obey orders to advance into areas under American artillery fire. Officers who tried to maintain discipline through the traditional German combination of appeals to duty and threats of punishment found that even the death penalty lost its deterrent effect when soldiers believed they were being sent to certain death. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the elderly German commander who had been brought out of retirement to lead the Ardennes offensive, would later admit in captivity that the proximity fuse had been decisive. In his assessment, the German attacks had not failed primarily due to American courage or tactical superiority, though both were present, but rather because the artillery fire they faced was simply beyond anything their training or doctrine had prepared them to handle. German tactical manuals, based on decades of experience with conventional artillery, provided no guidance for dealing with weapons that seemed to think for themselves. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, echoed these sentiments. His forces had initially made good progress in several sectors, achieving breakthrough in places and driving deep into American-held territory. But as proximity-fused artillery became more prevalent along the front, his attacks lost momentum and eventually stalled entirely. He specifically noted that even his most veteran units, soldiers who had previously shown extraordinary courage under fire, became increasingly reluctant to advance when they knew American artillery was present. The weapon had broken the will of the German army at a fundamental level. The statistical record supports these qualitative assessments. During the Battle of the Bulge, American forces fired approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells, representing a substantial but not overwhelming fraction of total artillery ammunition expended. Yet analysis of casualty figures showed that these shells were responsible for between 15 and 20,000 German casualties directly attributable to proximity fuse effects, not counting the indirect effects on German morale and operational tempo. The lethality multiplier, compared to conventional high-explosive shells, ranged from 5 to 10 times depending on terrain and target conditions. To put this in perspective, a single American artillery battalion equipped with proximity fuses could inflict casualties equivalent to what previously would have required a full artillery regiment firing conventional ammunition. This force multiplication effect meant that American commanders could achieve decisive results with fewer guns and less ammunition, a significant advantage in a mobile campaign where logistics were always challenging. It also meant that German forces could never achieve local superiority sufficient to overcome the technological disadvantage, no matter how cleverly they concentrated their forces. The industrial achievement behind the proximity fuse program deserves particular recognition. By the end of the war in Europe, American factories had produced approximately 22 million proximity fuses, each one containing more than 100 precision components that had to be manufactured to exacting tolerances and assembled with meticulous care. This represented perhaps the largest precision electronics manufacturing program ever attempted up to that point in history. Certainly the largest undertaken under wartime conditions, with the pressure of lives hanging in the balance. More than 100 companies participated in the program, coordinating their efforts across the country. The supply chain extended from raw materials to final assembly, with each company responsible for specific components or sub-assemblies. RCA focused on vacuum tubes, leveraging their expertise in radio manufacturing. General Electric handled power systems and some of the more complex electrical components. Sylvania specialized in glasswork for the tubes. Crossley Corporation, previously known for refrigerators and consumer appliances, retooled entire factories to produce fuse bodies and mechanical components. The workforce was predominantly female, reflecting the general wartime shift as men went into military service. Women who had never worked in manufacturing before found themselves soldering microscopic connections, testing electronic circuits, and performing quality control inspections that could literally mean the difference between life and death for soldiers thousands of miles away. They worked long shifts, often 6 or 7 days a week, under intense pressure to maintain production quotas while meeting unforgiving quality standards. Every defective fuse that slipped through could potentially fail at the critical moment when American troops needed artillery support. The quality control procedures developed for the proximity fuse program were revolutionary for their time. Each component received a serial number and was tracked through the entire manufacturing process. Random samples underwent destructive testing, being fired in test guns to verify that they would survive the firing stress and function correctly. Statistical analysis techniques, then in their infancy, were employed to identify trends that might indicate emerging quality problems before they became widespread. These methods would later form the foundation for modern quality assurance practices in electronics manufacturing. The cost of the program, exceeding $1 billion in wartime currency, represented an enormous investment of national resources. To provide context, that sum could have built dozens of battleships or thousands of aircraft. The decision to allocate such resources to a single weapons system reflected a conviction at the highest levels of government and military leadership that technological superiority could be decisive. That conviction was thoroughly vindicated in the Ardennes, where the proximity fuse helped turn what might have been a catastrophic Allied defeat into a clear American victory. Behind the military and industrial achievements lay the scientific foundations that made the proximity fuse possible. Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had essentially created a new field of electronics engineering. They had to solve problems that no one had previously attempted, building radio systems that could function after experiencing acceleration forces that would instantly destroy any commercial electronic device. The solutions they developed, from shock-resistant tube designs to innovative power supply systems using batteries activated by the firing shock itself, represented genuine scientific breakthroughs. The tiny vacuum tubes used in the fuse were marvels of miniaturization for their era. Standard radio tubes of the 1940s were typically several inches long and fragile enough that rough handling could break the internal filaments or crack the glass envelope. The proximity fuse tubes had to be shrunk down to the size of a pencil eraser, ruggedized to withstand thousands of G-forces, and still function reliably after being spun at enormous speeds and subjected to extreme temperature variations. Achieving this required completely rethinking tube design from first principles. One of the most elegant solutions developed by the team involved the use of glass ampules containing electrolyte that would shatter during firing, creating a short-lived battery that powered the fuse electronics during flight. This meant the fuse could be stored indefinitely without worrying about battery deterioration, yet would automatically activate the moment it was fired. The battery would only last a few seconds, but that was sufficient for the shell's flight time. This kind of creative problem-solving characterized the entire development effort. Dr. James Van Allen, who worked on the proximity fuse program during the war, would later become famous for discovering the radiation belts around Earth that bear his name. His experience with miniaturized electronics and high-reliability radio systems during the war proved invaluable when he later designed instruments for some of America's first space probes. The direct line from proximity fuse to space exploration exemplifies how weapons development can drive technological progress that eventually finds peaceful applications. The Germans, meanwhile, had no effective answer to the proximity fuse throughout the remainder of the war. After the initial shock in the Ardennes, German intelligence services attempted to recover unexploded American shells in hopes of understanding the technology. They were partially successful, eventually obtaining specimens that revealed the basic principles of operation. However, by early 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity and resources to develop and produce a counterweapon, even if they had possessed complete technical knowledge. German scientists who examined captured proximity fuses after the war expressed surprise at the elegance of the American design. They acknowledged that their earlier pessimism about the feasibility of such weapons had been misplaced and that the Americans had solved problems the Germans had assumed were unsolvable. There was particular respect for the manufacturing achievement, the ability to produce millions of complex devices reliably and at reasonable cost. This, more than the underlying science, was what the Germans found most impressive. The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond the Battle of the Bulge and World War II. The principles developed for this weapon became the foundation for essentially all guided munitions that followed. Modern cruise missiles, smart bombs, and surface-to-air missiles all owe a debt to the researchers who first figured out how to put electronics inside a projectile and make those electronics reliably trigger detonation at the optimal moment. The entire field of proximity sensing in military applications traces its ancestry directly back to the wartime fuse program. Even the organizational and management techniques developed to coordinate the proximity fuse production effort had lasting impact. The program demonstrated that highly complex technological systems could be mass-produced if proper attention was paid to standardization, quality control, and supply chain management. These lessons informed post-war industrial development in fields ranging from consumer electronics to aerospace. The modern integrated circuit industry, with its emphasis on clean rooms, statistical process control, and rigorous testing, operates according to principles that were first developed or refined during the proximity fuse program. For the soldiers who experienced the Battle of the Bulge, whether American or German, the proximity fuse represented a dividing line between the old warfare and the new. Before its introduction, artillery had been a powerful but somewhat predictable element of the battlefield. Experienced troops could learn to survive under artillery fire, could develop techniques and tactics that improved their odds. The proximity fuse changed that calculus fundamentally. Survival became more random, more dependent on factors outside individual control. This was the future of warfare arriving ahead of schedule. General George Patton, never one for understatement, declared flatly that the funny fuse had won the Battle of the Bulge for the Americans. While this was certainly an oversimplification, there is substantial truth in his assessment. Without the proximity fuse, American forces would still likely have stopped the German offensive eventually. The Wehrmacht's logistical problems, fuel shortages, and the gradual concentration of Allied forces would have produced the same ultimate outcome. However, the cost in American lives would have been significantly higher, the timeline likely longer, and the degree of German penetration deeper. The proximity fuse did not win the battle alone, but it made victory faster, cheaper, and more certain. The human cost of the battle remains sobering even when viewed through the lens of technological achievement. Approximately 19,000 American soldiers died during the Battle of the Bulge, with total American casualties exceeding 75,000 when wounded and missing are included. German losses were even heavier, approaching 100,000 casualties, including a disproportionate number of experienced officers and NCOs. These men, on both sides, were sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. Many of them were barely out of their teens, rushed into combat with minimal training and thrown into one of the most intense battles of the entire European war. For the German conscripts in particular, many of them born in the late 1920s and pressed into service as the Reich's manpower crisis deepened, the Ardennes was a death sentence delivered by a technology they could not understand. They died in forests where the trees themselves became weapons as proximity-fused shells shredded branches into deadly splinters. They died in open fields where the snow turned red under airbursts that gave no warning. They died along riverbanks, on hillsides, in village streets, cut down by fragments of steel guided by invisible radio waves. Their deaths marked the arrival of an age where the individual soldier's courage and skill mattered less than the sophistication of the weapons they faced. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January 1945, as German forces withdrew to their starting positions or beyond, having achieved none of their objectives. The town of Bastogne remained in American hands. Antwerp was never threatened. The Allied armies, far from being split, had actually grown stronger and more cohesive through the shared trial. Hitler's last gamble had failed completely, consuming the last significant reserves the Wehrmacht possessed and shortening the war by eliminating Germany's capacity for further strategic operations. In the years immediately following the war, as the full story of the proximity fuse gradually emerged from wartime secrecy, military analysts and historians began to grasp its significance. General Dwight Eisenhower, writing his memoirs, stated that if Germany had possessed proximity fuses on D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy might well have failed. The weapon was that decisive in his estimation. German defenders with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells could have devastated the airborne drops that secured the flanks of the invasion beaches. German artillery with proximity fuses could have turned the beaches themselves into killing zones impossible to cross. This counterfactual highlights an important truth about technological warfare. Small margins of advantage in key technologies can produce disproportionate effects on battlefield outcomes. The proximity fuse did not make American artillery marginally more effective. It made artillery orders of magnitude more lethal, fundamentally changing what was possible with existing gun systems. This kind of force multiplication, where a technological improvement produces effects far beyond its apparent size, became characteristic of 20th century warfare and continues to shape military thinking today. The proximity fuse program also demonstrated the critical importance of maintaining research and development efforts even during wartime. The British and Americans, despite facing enormous immediate demands for conventional weapons and equipment, allocated substantial resources to developing advanced technologies that might not be ready for years. This long-term thinking paid enormous dividends when weapons like the proximity fuse finally reached the battlefield. The Germans, by contrast, had cancelled their own proximity fuse research early in the war due to Hitler's insistence on short-term results, a decision that would haunt them years later in the Ardennes. Today, proximity fuses or their descendants are found in virtually every modern weapons system. Artillery shells, anti-aircraft missiles, air-to-air missiles, even naval mines use proximity sensing to optimize their effects. The basic principle that a weapon should trigger itself at the optimal moment based on sensing its environment has become so fundamental to weapons design that it is taken for granted. Few people today remember that this capability had to be invented, that it required years of dedicated research and billions of dollars in development costs before becoming practical. The factory workers who built those 22 million fuses during the war, the women who soldered thousands of connections and inspected millions of parts, returned to civilian life with skills and experience that helped fuel America's post-war industrial expansion. Many went on to careers in electronics, bringing with them the precision and quality consciousness that had been drilled into them during wartime production. The electronics revolution of the 1950s and 60s, when transistor radios and television sets became common household items, was built on foundations laid during programs like the proximity fuse effort. The scientists and engineers involved in the program similarly dispersed into academia, government research laboratories, and private industry after the war. They carried with them not just technical knowledge, but also an understanding of how to organize large-scale research efforts and manage complex development programs. This experience proved invaluable during the Cold War as the United States embarked on even more ambitious technological programs, including nuclear weapons development, ballistic missiles, and eventually the space program. In the Ardennes today, monuments and museums preserve the memory of the Battle of the Bulge. Tourists visit the forests and fields where American and German soldiers fought and died during that frigid December and January. Most of these visitors know the basic story: Hitler's last offensive, American resistance, the siege of Bastogne, Patton's relief column. Few know about the proximity fuse or appreciate how decisively this technology influenced the battle's outcome. The weapon that was once among America's most closely guarded secrets has faded into historical obscurity, even as its descendants continue to shape modern warfare. For military historians and weapons specialists, however, the proximity fuse remains a subject of fascination and study. It represents a pure case study in how technological innovation can alter warfare fundamentally and rapidly. From the first unauthorized combat use on December 16th to widespread deployment across the entire European theatre by early January, barely 3 weeks elapsed. This rapid fielding of a revolutionary capability, driven by battlefield necessity and enabled by existing production capacity, demonstrated that the tempo of technological warfare could be extraordinarily fast when circumstances demanded. The legacy of those frozen weeks in the Ardennes extends beyond military history into the realm of philosophy and ethics. The proximity fuse represented a step toward autonomous weapons, devices that make their own decisions about when to explode based on programming rather than direct human control. While the complexity was primitive by modern standards, just a simple radio circuit measuring signal strength, the principle was established. Weapons could sense their environment and trigger themselves without human intervention in the final moment. Today's debates about autonomous weapons systems, killer robots, and the ethics of removing humans from targeting decisions all trace their lineage back to that original proximity fuse and the questions it raised about the nature of warfare in an age of increasingly sophisticated technology.